The studio doors burst open with theatrical precision, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez strode into the lion's den. Every step was measured, every movement calculated like a predator approaching its prey. At 35, she moved with the fluid confidence of youth combined with the purposeful stride of someone who had already conquered the impossible, from bartender to the halls of Congress in a single meteoric rise. Her dark navy suit was armor for the modern political warrior. Sharp lines, impeccable tailoring, every detail designed to project competence and authority. The fabric caught the studio lights as she moved, creating an almost ethereal glow around her figure. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that said serious business, while her brown eyes blazed with the inner fire that had already made her the most recognizable face of progressive politics. But it was what she carried that would prove most interesting: a thick manila folder clutched in her left hand, its contents a mystery that would soon prove decisive. Documents, facts, figures, the ammunition of intellectual warfare. The crowd erupted like a stadium split between rival teams. The progressive half leaped to their feet, their cheers echoing off the studio walls like thunder rolling across mountains. Signs waved, phones flashed, and voices rose in a crescendo of generational pride. AOC, AOC, AOC. They chanted, the syllables becoming a war cry. The traditional half remained seated, their applause polite but restrained, like generals acknowledging a worthy opponent before battle. Their expressions ranged from skeptical curiosity to outright hostility, arms crossed in defensive positions, ready to witness their champion demolish this upstart pretender. AOC navigated through this storm of emotion with the grace of a diplomat entering hostile territory. She nodded to both sides of the audience, her smile warm but her eyes alert. This was enemy territory, and she knew it. Every camera lens was a weapon pointed at her, every microphone a potential trap, every moment an opportunity for her opponent to strike. Round one begins now. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, Judge Judy's voice cut through the applause like a blade through silk, commanding immediate silence. The authority in her tone was absolute. Decades of courtroom dominance compressed into 3 words. Sit down and prepare to receive a lesson from someone who has seen more of life than you've read about on Twitter. The opening shot fired. First blood drawn. The conservative half of the audience rumbled their approval like distant thunder. This was their champion in action, direct, uncompromising, brooking no nonsense from presumptuous youth. AOC's response was a masterclass in diplomatic warfare. She moved to her chair with the fluid grace of a dancer, settling into position with deliberate care. Her posture was respectful but not submissive, attentive but not intimidated. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured tones of someone who had learned to navigate hostile political waters. Your Honor, she began, the formal address perfectly pitched to acknowledge authority while maintaining dignity. I'm here not for a lesson, but for a dialogue between equals. The crowd explodes. The word equals detonated like a bomb in the studio. The progressive side erupted in cheers, sensing their champion's refusal to be diminished. The traditional side responded with a low growl of disapproval. How dare this young upstart claim equality with their judicial giant? Judge Judy's eyebrows shot up like artillery pieces finding their range. Her grip on the gavel tightened, knuckles whitening with the pressure. Equals? The word dripped with incredulous disdain, each syllable a separate insult. Little girl, when I began my judicial career, you weren't even a gleam in your father's eye. You and your generation think the world owes you something, respect, attention, power, without earning any of it. The attack was surgical in its precision, designed to establish the hierarchy immediately and decisively. Judge Judy leaned forward like a predator sensing weakness, her voice rising with the passion of righteous indignation. I've spent 4 decades serving justice, maintaining order, teaching respect for authority and tradition. What have you done except complain on social media and propose fantasy legislation that would bankrupt this great nation? The traditional audience roared its approval, sensing their champion drawing first blood. Signs reading experience matters and respect your elders waved like battle flags in a victorious charge. But AOC's response revealed the steel beneath the diplomatic silk. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her folder, the only outward sign of the fires burning within. Her voice remained level, controlled, professional, but her eyes narrowed with the focus of a marksman taking aim. "Judge Scheindlin, I understand your concerns about the younger generation," she replied, each word carefully measured. "Many established leaders have expressed similar sentiments throughout history. Change can be unsettling. The psychological warfare intensifies." Judge Judy sensed the subtle challenge in those words and responded with escalating force. Rising from her chair like an ancient goddess of judgment, she brandished her gavel like a weapon of war. "Change, is that what you call your socialist fantasies? Your Green New Deal? What is that except an expensive game of environmental make-believe?" The attack shifted to policy, and the battlefield transformed. This was no longer just about respect and generational differences. This was about the fundamental direction of American governance. The stakes had just risen exponentially. 40 years I've served the law," Judge Judy continued, her voice building to a crescendo of righteous fury. 40 years of real work, real decisions, real consequences. And you? What's your experience? A couple of years serving drinks and thinking that qualifies you to run the country? The personal attack landed like a heavy punch, designed to diminish and humiliate. The conservative audience cheered, sensing their champion's dominance. But something was shifting in the progressive section. They weren't cheering, but they weren't backing down either. They were waiting, watching, trusting their fighter to respond. AOC absorbed the blow with the composure of a boxer who had been hit harder and survived stronger opponents. She made notes on a pad, her movements deliberate and calm, giving no satisfaction to her attacker. But underneath the diplomatic exterior, the calculation was intense. "Judge," she said finally, her voice carrying new undertones of steel, "you mentioned the Green New Deal. I'm curious. Have you had the opportunity to read the full text of House Resolution 109? The question hangs in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For the first time since the battle began, Judge Judy hesitated. It was barely perceptible, a microsecond pause, a slight shift in her eyes, a momentary tightening around her mouth. But in the world of high-stakes political combat, such micro-expressions were equivalent to bleeding wounds on a heavyweight boxer. The cameras caught it all. The zoom lenses focused with predatory precision on the judge's face, capturing every nuance of expression. The studio audience sensed the shift in momentum like animals sensing an approaching storm. "I've read excerpts," Judge Judy replied, her voice carrying the first note of defensiveness heard all evening. "I've read enough to know impractical legislation when I see it. I don't need to waste time on socialist wish lists disguised as policy." But AOC's response cut through the bluster like a surgeon's scalpel. Her voice remained perfectly level, but now it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had just gained the upper hand. "Excerpts," she repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air like an accusation. "I see. The tide begins to turn." Those two simple words, excerpts and "I see," struck with devastating effectiveness. They didn't attack, didn't insult, didn't raise the temperature of the conflict. Instead, they simply highlighted the gap between criticism and knowledge, between opinion and information. The progressive side of the audience began to stir. They sensed their champion had just landed her first significant blow. The conservative side remained loyal but less certain. Their fighter had just admitted to incomplete preparation for this battle. Judge Judy's face flushed slightly, the red creeping up her neck like a tide mark of rising anger. She recognized the tactical shift, but had committed herself to a line of attack that was now revealed as potentially flawed. "Don't you dare lecture me about reading comprehension, young lady," she snapped, her gavel coming down hard on the desk. "I've been analyzing legal documents since before you were born. I can spot unrealistic legislation from a mile away. But the damage was done. The tiny crack in her armor of absolute authority had been exposed, and AOC had the political instincts to recognize the opening. She didn't press the advantage immediately. That would come later. Instead, she simply nodded with the patience of someone who knew she held better cards than her opponent realized. "Of course, Your Honor," AOC replied with perfect diplomatic neutrality. Experience certainly has its value. The words were respectful on the surface, but beneath them lay layers of meaning that resonated throughout the studio. The progressive audience began to sense that their underdog might not be such an underdog after all. The traditional side maintained their support, but the absolute certainty of their champion's victory had taken its first hit. The first round concludes with blood in the water. As the initial exchange of this political heavyweight bout came to a close, the scorecards were already being calculated in the minds of viewers across America. Judge Judy had established her dominance through force of personality and decades of authority, but AOC had revealed that she would not be intimidated or diminished. More importantly, the young Congresswoman had identified a crucial weakness in her opponent's preparation. The admission of reading only excerpts would prove to be a strategic error that would haunt the rest of this confrontation. The studio atmosphere crackled with electric anticipation. Both fighters had shown their styles. Judge Judy's overwhelming force versus AOC's surgical precision. The traditional approach of authority demanding respect versus the modern approach of respect being earned through competence. The cameras continued their predatory circling. The audience maintained their partisan divide, and the combatants prepared for the next phase of what was already shaping up to be a defining moment in American political discourse. Round 2 was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The manila folder in AOC's hand seemed to pulse with potential energy, its contents still mysterious, but increasingly significant. Judge Judy's gavel remained ready for action, but the absolute confidence of its wielder had taken its first microscopic dent. In the harsh studio lights of this televised coliseum, two visions of American leadership prepared to continue their battle for the hearts and minds of a divided nation. The first blood had been drawn, the first weakness exposed, and the first sign given that this would not be the one-sided demolition that many had expected. The revolution would not be televised. It was being televised, live, and in real time, as a new generation of political leadership announced its arrival on the national stage. The crack in Judge Judy's armor of absolute authority had been microscopic, barely visible to the naked eye, but in the unforgiving arena of televised political combat, even the smallest wound could prove fatal. The admission of reading only excerpts hung in the studio air like the scent of blood to a pack of wolves, and Judge Judy's predatory instincts recognized the danger immediately. Her response was swift, brutal, and devastating in its intensity. "Don't you dare try to intellectualize with me, young lady." The words erupted from her like lava from a volcanic eruption, her voice rising to levels that made the studio's sound engineers frantically adjust their equipment. The gavel in her hand came down with the force of Thor's hammer, the sharp crack echoing through the stunned silence like a gunshot. Judge Judy rose from her chair with the fury of an ancient war goddess ascending to battle, her black robes billowing around her like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. Her eyes blazed with 40 years of accumulated authority being challenged by what she perceived as youthful arrogance and generational entitlement. "You sit there with your fancy economics degree and your Twitter followers, thinking you understand the real world," she continued, her voice building to a crescendo that made the studio walls seem to vibrate. "But what do you really know? What have you actually accomplished besides serving drinks and posing for magazine covers?" The crowd erupts in tribal warfare. The conservative half of the audience exploded into thunderous approval, their cheers rolling across the studio like artillery fire. Signs reading "Respect Experience" and "Judy for America" waved frantically above their heads. They sensed their champion unleashing her full power, the nuclear option of judicial fury that had reduced countless defendants to whimpering submission. But the progressive side of the studio responded with equal intensity. their voices rising in defensive solidarity. "Let her speak," they chanted, creating a wall of sound that transformed the television studio into something resembling a Roman Colosseum at its most bloodthirsty. AOC absorbed this barrage of verbal artillery with the composure of a seasoned politician who had weathered far worse storms. Her face remained a mask of professional calm, but the cameras caught the subtle signs of internal pressure building, the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible clenching of her jaw muscles, the way her free hand formed a fist beneath the table where millions of viewers couldn't see. But she held her position like a fortress under siege, refusing to give her attacker the satisfaction of visible damage. Judge Judy escalates to total warfare. Sensing that her initial assault had failed to break her opponent's defensive lines, Judge Judy shifted tactics with the ruthless efficiency of a military strategist adapting to battlefield conditions. If professionalism wouldn't work, she would deploy the heavy artillery of personal destruction. "Your Green New Deal." She spat the words like profanity, her voice dripping with contempt that could corrode steel. What is that except the fever dream of an entitled millennial who thinks Instagram likes qualify as legislative experience? You want to spend trillions of taxpayer dollars on environmental fantasies while real Americans struggle to pay their bills. The attack was designed to be comprehensive and overwhelming, combining generational warfare, economic fear-mongering, and social media dismissal into a single devastating payload. Judge Judy's voice rose with each accusation, her hands gesturing wildly as if conducting an orchestra of destruction. "You talk about climate change and green jobs like some kind of messiah, but you've never run a business, never made a payroll, never had to make the hard decisions that keep this country running." The words came faster now, a machine gun burst of criticism designed to overwhelm any possible response. "You're a bartender who got lucky in one election and now thinks she can redesign the entire American economy." The personal attacks reached nuclear intensity. What happened next would be replayed and analyzed by political commentators for years to come. Judge Judy, sensing that her opponent remained unbroken despite the withering assault, made the fatal decision to cross into territory that even her most devoted supporters would later acknowledge went too far. "Your college education," she sneered, her voice taking on the mocking tone of a playground bully who had found their victim's deepest insecurity. "Boston University economics. What do they teach you there? How to mix the perfect cocktail of socialism and stupidity. Did your professors explain how to destroy free market capitalism while pretending to help working families?" The studio atmosphere shifted palpably. Even among Judge Judy's most ardent supporters, uncomfortable glances were exchanged. The attack had moved beyond political disagreement into personal humiliation, crossing lines that separated legitimate criticism from character assassination. But Judge Judy, intoxicated by decades of unchallenged authority and the roar of her partisan crowd, pressed forward into increasingly dangerous territory. "In your work experience as a bartender, I suppose mixing drinks taught you everything you need to know about international trade policy? Did serving cocktails to Wall Street executives give you insights into financial regulation?" Her laughter was sharp and cruel, designed to wound and diminish. "Maybe you learned about healthcare policy by cleaning up after drunk customers." AOC reaches her breaking point, but controls the explosion. For the first time since entering the studio, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez showed visible signs of the internal pressure reaching critical levels. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her manila folder with the force of someone holding onto a lifeline in a storm. Her breathing became slightly more shallow, her posture more rigid, as if every muscle in her body was straining against the impulse to launch a counterattack that would match her opponent's fury. The cameras zoomed in with predatory precision, capturing every micro-expression of someone being pushed to their absolute limit. The progressive side of the audience leaned forward in their seats, sensing their champion's distress and ready to explode in defensive rage. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of erupting in reciprocal fury, AOC took a slow, deliberate breath. Her fingers relaxed their death grip on the folder. Her shoulders settled back into a position of controlled composure. When she looked up at Judge Judy, her eyes held not anger, but something far more dangerous to her opponent, the cold calculation of someone who had just been handed the perfect opportunity to destroy their attacker. "Judge Scheindlin," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, "you've mentioned several times that I haven't read your work carefully enough." The tone shifts ominously. The change in AOC's voice was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was the defensive, diplomatic tone of the opening rounds. In its place was something harder, more focused, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had just realized they held all the winning cards. Judge Judy, still riding the adrenaline high of her verbal assault, failed to recognize the danger signals. "That's right. You haven't done your homework." Well, AOC continued with the patience of a chess grandmaster who had just seen checkmate in 3 moves. "I'm curious whether you've done yours." The folder opens. The game changes everything. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of televised political discourse. With the slow, deliberate movements of someone savoring a long-anticipated moment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened her manila folder. The sound of papers rustling might as well have been the clash of armor as a knight drew his sword. Every camera in the studio swiveled to focus on the documents being revealed, their contents still mysterious, but suddenly pregnant with devastating potential. House Resolution 109. AOC began, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had shifted from defense to offense, also known as the Green New Deal. 14 pages of detailed policy proposals, economic analysis, and implementation strategies. She lifted the first document with the precision of a surgeon selecting the perfect scalpel. "You mentioned reading excerpts, Judge. I'm wondering which excerpts those were, because I'd like to discuss some specific sections with you." Judge Judy realizes she's walked into a trap. The color began to drain from Judge Judy's face as the full magnitude of her strategic error became apparent. She had attacked a policy proposal without thoroughly understanding its contents, and now faced the prospect of being systematically dismantled by someone who knew every word, every statistic, every economic projection contained within those pages. Page 3, Section 4. AOC continued with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The Green New Deal calls for the creation of 20 million new jobs in renewable energy, infrastructure modernization, and environmental restoration over the next decade. These aren't fantasy positions. They're based on economic modeling from the Congressional Budget Office and independent analysis from leading economists. The progressive side of the audience began to stir with excitement, sensing their champion's counterattack beginning in earnest. The conservative side maintained their support, but with noticeably less enthusiasm. Their fighter was being dissected with surgical precision. Page 7 details the specific funding mechanisms. AOC continued, her voice gaining strength and confidence with each fact deployed. Investment tax credits, green bonds, and reallocation of existing fossil fuel subsidies. The total projected cost over 10 years is actually less than we spent on the 2008 financial bailout, but with far greater long-term economic benefits. The methodical destruction begins. Judge Judy attempted to interrupt with her traditional bulldozer approach. "Don't lecture me. Young lady, I know impractical legislation when I see it." But AOC had seized control of the battlefield's tempo, and she refused to yield the advantage. "Judge, with respect, if you've only read excerpts, how can you be certain about the legislation's practicality?" Page 11 contains detailed cost-benefit analysis showing a positive return on investment within 15 years, not to mention the avoided costs of climate damage. The role reversal was complete and devastating. The young congresswoman who had entered the studio as the underdog challenger was now controlling the pace, the content, and the direction of the conversation. Judge Judy, accustomed to absolute dominance, found herself in the unfamiliar position of being systematically outmaneuvered by superior preparation and deeper knowledge. Furthermore, AOC continued, building momentum like a freight train gathering speed. The resolution specifically addresses concerns about economic disruption by including provisions for job retraining, transition assistance for displaced workers, and federal guarantees for communities dependent on fossil fuel industries. The killer blow approaches, but AOC wasn't finished. Having established her command of the policy details, she prepared to deploy what would become the most quoted exchange of the entire confrontation. "Judge Scheindlin, you've spoken several times about understanding real America and the struggles of working families," she said, her voice carrying new undertones of steel wrapped in velvet diplomacy. "I'm curious about your perspective on this, given your unique position in American media." Judge Judy, still reeling from the policy barrage, failed to recognize the trap being set. "My position? I've worked for everything I have. I understand hard work and real consequences." "Absolutely," AOC agreed with devastating pleasantness. "According to public records, your salary from the Judge Judy show is approximately $47 million per year for producing a television entertainment program. My congressional salary is $174,000 per year for representing 700,000 constituents in the Bronx and Queens." Nuclear detonation in the studio. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Even the camera operators stopped their movements, as if afraid that any sound might break the spell of this devastating mathematical precision. So when we discuss who better understands the financial pressures facing working American families, AOC continued with the quiet confidence of someone who had just deployed a tactical nuclear weapon. "I wonder if we might consider that my constituents and I live much closer to that economic reality than someone earning $47 million annually for television work." The progressive side of the audience erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for decades. The applause was thunderous, sustained, and accompanied by cheers that threatened to bring down the studio ceiling. Even some members of the conservative section found themselves nodding involuntarily at the simple mathematical truth of the comparison. Judge Judy's face cycled through several shades of red as the full impact of the reversal struck home. For the first time in her long career of judicial dominance, she found herself speechless, outmaneuvered, and publicly embarrassed by an opponent who had turned her own weapons against her. The historical parallel delivers the final blow. But AOC wasn't finished. Having established the economic disparity, she prepared to deploy her most sophisticated weapon, the historical parallel that would reframe the entire generational conflict. "Judge, you've criticized young politicians for trying to change established systems," she said, her voice now carrying the warmth of someone offering wisdom rather than delivering punishment. "But I've been thinking about your own career, and I wonder if you remember 1982 when you were appointed to the New York Family Court." Judge Judy's eyes narrowed with suspicion, sensing another trap but unable to see its precise shape. "You were one of the youngest judges in the system, and certainly one of very few women in such a position," AOC continued with historical precision. "I imagine some of your older, more experienced male colleagues questioned whether a relatively young woman could truly understand the law as well as they did, whether you had the proper experience and gravitas for such responsibility." The trap springs with perfect precision. The parallel was elegant, devastating, and impossible to refute. Judge Judy found herself caught between defending her younger self's right to challenge established authority and maintaining her current position that young politicians should defer to their elders. Every generation of leaders has faced skepticism from their predecessors. AOC continued, pressing her advantage with the skill of a master debater. "You changed the judicial system by bringing a more direct, accessible approach to legal proceedings. We're trying to change the political system by bringing more responsive, inclusive approaches to governance." The studio audience sat transfixed as they witnessed a complete inversion of the power dynamic that had defined the evening's opening. The young congresswoman who had been dismissed as an inexperienced upstart was now delivering a masterclass in political rhetoric, historical analysis, and strategic communication. Judge Judy, for perhaps the first time in her professional life, found herself genuinely outmatched by an opponent who had proven superior in preparation, knowledge, and tactical execution. The round ends with total domination established. As the second phase of this historic confrontation drew to a close, the scorecard being calculated in millions of American minds showed a complete reversal from the evening's opening. AOC had transformed from defensive underdog to dominant force, wielding facts like weapons and turning her opponent's attacks into opportunities for devastating counterstrikes. The manila folder, once mysterious, had revealed itself as an arsenal of political ammunition that had systematically destroyed every line of attack Judge Judy had attempted. The young woman who had been mocked for her bartending experience had demonstrated a command of policy details that exposed her critics' superficial preparation. Most importantly, AOC had achieved something that seemed impossible at the evening's start. She had made Judge Judy, the undefeated champion of courtroom dominance, appear unprepared, out of touch, and intellectually overmatched. The cameras continued their relentless surveillance, capturing every moment of this political earthquake. The divided audience had witnessed something unprecedented, the torch of American leadership being passed not through electoral victory or institutional appointment, but through superior argument and intellectual combat broadcast live to the nation. Round 3 awaited, but the outcome no longer seemed certain. Final round. The champion is reeling. Could she mount one last desperate comeback? The studio atmosphere had transformed from electric anticipation to stunned disbelief as millions of viewers witnessed the impossible unfold before their eyes. Judge Judy Scheindlin, the undefeated titan of television justice, sat behind her desk like a general surveying a battlefield where all her strategic positions had been overrun by a superior force. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she gripped her gavel, the symbol of absolute authority that had never failed her in 4 decades of judicial combat. The weapon that had crushed thousands of defendants into submission now felt heavy and useless in her grasp, a relic from an era when force alone could determine victory. Across the arena, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat with the composed confidence of someone who had not merely survived the storm, but had redirected its fury back upon her attacker. The manila folder lay open before her like a general's battle map, its contents having proven more devastating than any conventional weapon. Her brown eyes held no malice, no triumph, only the steady gaze of someone who had proven their point through superior preparation and unshakable composure. The divided audience sat in relative silence for the first time all evening, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of American political theater. Even the most partisan supporters on both sides recognized they were observing a seismic shift in the landscape of power and authority. Judy launches her final, desperate assault, like a wounded warrior making one last charge against impossible odds. Judge Judy gathered the remnants of her shattered offensive capability for a final assault. Her voice, though lacking its earlier thunderous authority, still carried the desperate intensity of someone fighting for survival. "You may be clever with your statistics and your prepared talking points," she began, her words coming faster and less precisely than her usual surgical strikes. "But your ideas will still destroy this country's economy. You can quote all the studies you want, but common sense tells us that spending trillions on environmental programs will bankrupt America." The attack was broader now, less focused, like artillery fire from a retreating army. Loud, but lacking the precision that had characterized her earlier bombardments. Judge Judy's legendary ability to identify and exploit specific weaknesses had been replaced by generic talking points that could have been deployed against any progressive politician. "Working families don't need lectures about climate change," she continued, her voice rising but carrying none of its earlier commanding presence. "They need jobs, security, and politicians who understand that you can't just wave a magic wand and transform the entire energy sector without destroying millions of livelihoods." The crowd responds with diminishing enthusiasm. The conservative section of the audience dutifully applauded, but their response lacked the volcanic energy that had characterized their earlier support. Even Judge Judy's most devoted supporters could sense that their champion was fighting from a position of weakness, deploying arguments that had already been systematically dismantled by her opponent's superior preparation. The progressive side remained respectfully quiet, recognizing that their fighter had already achieved victory and needed no additional support. They watched with the confidence of supporters whose champion had proven herself under the most intense pressure imaginable. AOC listened to this final barrage with the patient attention of someone allowing their opponent to exhaust their remaining ammunition. Her posture remained professional, her expression attentive, giving no indication that she considered the battle already won. But the cameras caught the subtle signs of someone who had transcended the immediate conflict to see its larger significance. The slight relaxation around her eyes, the way her breathing had returned to normal rhythms, the unconscious straightening of her shoulders as she prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be the decisive response. AOC delivers the finishing masterclass. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally responded, her voice carried a quality that hadn't been present at any earlier point in the evening, the unmistakable authority of someone who had earned the right to speak as an equal through superior performance under pressure. Judge Sheindlin, she began, her tone respectful, but carrying new undertones of strength that commanded immediate attention. I appreciate your concerns about economic disruption, and I want to address them directly because they represent legitimate questions that deserve serious answers. The response was a masterclass in political communication, acknowledging her opponent's points while simultaneously establishing her own authority to address them. No dismissiveness, no counterattacks, just the confident competence of someone who had done her homework and was prepared to defend it. The economic modeling I referenced isn't based on wishful thinking or ideological preference. She continued with the measured precision of someone laying out an irrefutable logical sequence. It comes from the same Congressional Budget Office that analyzes every major piece of legislation, using the same methodologies that have guided economic policy for decades. She gestured toward her open folder with the casual confidence of someone referencing unassailable facts. The transition to renewable energy has already created over 3 million jobs in the United States, with average wages 20% higher than traditional energy sector positions. This isn't theoretical, it's measurable economic reality happening right now in all 50 states. The professional coup de grace. But then AOC shifted to territory that would prove most devastating to her opponent. Not policy details or economic statistics, but the fundamental principles of respectful discourse that Judge Judy had abandoned in her desperation to maintain dominance. However, Judge, I want to address something more important than any specific policy disagreement, she said, her voice taking on the grave tone of someone delivering a crucial lesson. Throughout this discussion, you've repeatedly moved from criticizing my ideas to attacking my character, my background, and my qualifications. The words landed with surgical precision, highlighting the distinction between legitimate policy debate and personal assault. Every viewer could recognize the difference, and Judge Judy's tactical errors were now illuminated for all to see. You're absolutely entitled to disagree with the Green New Deal, with my economic priorities, with any aspect of my policy agenda. AOC continued with the patience of someone educating rather than attacking. That's not only your right, it's essential to democratic discourse. But when we move from challenging ideas to questioning someone's fundamental competence based on their age, their previous employment, or their educational background, we're no longer engaged in policy debate. The moment of truth arrives. The studio fell into complete silence as AOC delivered what everyone recognized as the defining moment of the entire confrontation. Respect isn't something that can be demanded, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone stating an irrefutable truth. It has to be earned through our actions, our preparation, and our willingness to engage with opposing viewpoints in good faith. I came here tonight prepared to discuss policy details because I respect you enough to assume you wanted a substantive conversation. The parallel structure of the statement was elegant and devastating. She had shown respect through preparation, while her opponent had shown disrespect through personal attacks. When we resort to personal attacks instead of addressing substantive arguments, we're not demonstrating strength or authority. AOC concluded with the finality of someone delivering a verdict. We're demonstrating that we either don't understand the issues well enough to debate them on their merits, or we don't respect our opponents enough to engage them intellectually. The knockout blow that transcends combat. But the most devastating aspect of AOC's response wasn't its logical precision or its moral authority. It was its tone. She had delivered this comprehensive dismantling of Judge Judy's approach without anger, without vindictiveness, without any of the personal animosity that might have provided her opponent with grounds for counterattack. Instead, she had maintained the professional demeanor of someone who genuinely respected the office and experience of her opponent, while firmly establishing that respect must be reciprocal to be meaningful. Judge Judy sat in stunned silence, her gavel motionless in her hand, as the full weight of her strategic and tactical defeat became undeniable. For perhaps the first time in her legendary career, she found herself completely without response. Not because she lacked words, but because any response would only further highlight the comprehensive nature of her defeat. The impossible happens. The champion surrenders. What occurred next would be analyzed and debated by political commentators, communication experts, and leadership scholars for decades to come. Judge Judy Sheindlin, the woman who had never backed down from any fight, who had built her reputation on never admitting error or showing weakness, did something that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of her personality. She surrendered. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like watching a mighty fortress lower its battle flags in slow motion. Her shoulders settled back in her chair, her grip on the gavel relaxed, and her expression shifted from combative fury to something approaching contemplative recognition. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, she began, her voice carrying tones that hadn't been heard from her in the entire evening. Uncertainty, reflection, and something that might have been approaching respect. The use of the formal address was significant. Throughout the confrontation, she had dismissed her opponent as young lady, little girl, or simply you in tones dripping with condescension. The shift to proper formal address represented a fundamental change in how she perceived the woman sitting across from her. Perhaps, she continued, the word hanging in the air like a white flag slowly being raised above a battlefield. Perhaps I may have underestimated your preparation and your capabilities. The studio erupts in history-making applause. The admission struck the studio audience like a lightning bolt, producing a moment of absolute silence followed by an explosion of reaction that threatened to shake the building's foundations. Even Judge Judy's most devoted supporters found themselves applauding, not for their champion's victory, but for her grace in acknowledging a superior performance. The progressive side of the audience erupted in sustained ovation, but their cheers carried no vindictiveness or mockery. Instead, they celebrated what they recognized as a historic moment: the peaceful transfer of authority through superior argument and intellectual combat. But the most remarkable response came from AOC herself. Rather than basking in the moment of triumph or delivering any form of victory speech, she responded with the gracious magnanimity that would complete her transformation from challenger to leader. Grace in victory, the mark of true leadership. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's response to Judge Judy's admission would become one of the most quoted statements in modern political discourse, replayed endlessly not for its cleverness or its devastating wit, but for its fundamental decency and wisdom. Judge Sheindlin, she said, her voice warm with genuine respect and understanding, that happens to the best of us. Every one of us has found ourselves in situations where our initial assumptions proved incomplete or incorrect. The response was perfect in its simplicity and generosity. No gloating, no victory laps, no attempt to further humiliate an opponent who had already conceded defeat. Instead, she offered the dignity of shared human experience and the recognition that even the most accomplished individuals can find themselves surprised by circumstances. I have tremendous respect for your career, your achievements, and your contributions to American justice, she continued with the genuine warmth of someone who truly meant every word. Tonight's disagreement doesn't diminish any of that. It just proves that we all benefit when we approach each other with curiosity rather than assumptions. The symbolic crown passes to a new generation. The cameras captured every moment of this extraordinary exchange, but they also caught something larger and more significant. The symbolic moment when American political leadership passed from one generation to another, not through electoral victory or institutional transfer, but through demonstrated competence under pressure. AOC had proven herself capable of withstanding the most intense political assault imaginable while maintaining her composure, her principles, and her respect for democratic discourse. More importantly, she had shown that preparation, knowledge, and intellectual honesty could triumph over authority based solely on experience and tradition. Judge Judy, in her gracious acknowledgement of defeat, had paradoxically restored some of the dignity that her earlier personal attacks had cost her. By recognizing superior performance when she encountered it, she demonstrated the wisdom that had made her a beloved figure to millions of Americans. The audience unity moment, transcending political divide. As the evening drew to its close, something unprecedented occurred in the deeply divided studio audience. The partisan barriers that had defined the evening's earlier exchanges began to dissolve as both sides recognized they had witnessed something larger than a simple political debate. Conservative supporters who had arrived expecting to see their champion demolish an unprepared young upstart found themselves grudgingly impressed by AOC's competence and grace under pressure. Progressive supporters who had feared for their representative's survival in hostile territory now celebrated not just her victory, but the manner in which she had achieved it. The applause that filled the studio was no longer divided along partisan lines. Instead, it represented something rarer and more valuable. The recognition that democratic discourse at its best could elevate everyone involved, including those who disagreed with the eventual outcome. The new era begins. As the studio lights began to dim and the cameras prepared for their final shots, the significance of what had transpired became clear to everyone present. They had witnessed more than a political debate or even a generational confrontation. They had seen the emergence of a new model of American leadership. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had proven that respect could indeed be earned rather than demanded, that preparation could triumph over presumption, and that grace in victory was more powerful than dominance in defeat. She had shown that a new generation of leaders could honor the achievements of their predecessors while still insisting on their right to be judged by their own merits. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that the future of American political discourse didn't have to be defined by the angry divisions and personal attacks that had characterized so much recent public debate. Instead, it could be elevated through rigorous preparation, intellectual honesty, and the fundamental respect for democratic principles that allowed opponents to find common ground even in disagreement. Judge Judy, in her own way, had contributed to this lesson by ultimately recognizing excellence when she encountered it, proving that wisdom could transcend generational boundaries when approached with genuine openness. The crown of leadership passes forward. As the evening concluded and America processed what they had witnessed, one truth emerged with crystal clarity. They had seen the future of their political leadership, and it was more prepared, more professional, and more principled than many had dared to hope. The young congresswoman who had entered the studio as an underdog challenger left as something far more significant. A proven leader who had earned her authority through performance under pressure, demonstrated her commitment to democratic values under assault, and shown the grace and wisdom that true leadership required. The revolution hadn't been televised after all. It had been something far more powerful. It had been demonstrated, one carefully prepared argument at a time, until even its most skeptical observers had no choice but to acknowledge its legitimacy. America had found its future, and it looked exactly like what the founders had always hoped democracy could produce. leaders chosen not by birthright or tradition, but by their ability to serve their constituents with competence, integrity, and unwavering dedication to the principles that made self-governance possible. The torch had been passed, and it burned brighter than ever.